The escape pod screamed through the void like a dying star, its hull glowing cherry red from atmospheric friction. As it plummeted toward the barren surface of Kethera, inside, Princess Naya Celestini pressed her palms against the cracked viewport, watching her world, her life disappear into the darkness behind her. The betrayal still burned in her chest, more searing than the heat radiating from the pod's failing systems. Just hours ago, she had stood in the crystal chambers of the ethereal Dominion's High Council, listening to voices she had trusted since childhood declare her a traitor to the crown. The charges were fabricated, she knew that much. Her crime hadn't been treason, it had been asking too many questions. About the Dominion's treatment of the outer colonies, about the forced relocations, and the mining operations that stripped entire worlds bare. Her crime had been caring too much about people the Council deemed expendable. The pod's emergency beacon wailed as it struck the moon's surface, carving a molten furrow through the crystalline sand before finally grinding to a halt against a cluster of abandoned mining equipment. Naya tasted blood on her lips, felt the warm trickle down her forehead where she'd struck the control panel. The silence that followed the crash was absolute. No atmosphere to carry sound, no life to disturb the ancient peace of this forgotten place. Her environmental suit was damaged but functional, the small oxygen supply giving her perhaps 6 hours. Before the recyclers failed completely, she activated the emergency beacon. Though she doubted anyone would come, the Council had made it clear that her exile was permanent, her existence now an embarrassment to be forgotten. Still, she had to try. The alternative was to become another skeleton in the vast graveyard of space. Another cautionary tale whispered in the halls of power. The moon's surface stretched endlessly in all directions, a wasteland of glass and metal, where corporate mining operations had once torn precious minerals from the ground. Kethera had been abandoned for decades, its resources depleted, its purpose served. Now it was nothing more than a monument to galactic greed, a perfect place for the Dominion to dispose of its inconvenient truths. Naya stumbled away from the wreckage, her suit's headlamp cutting through the perpetual twilight. The gravity here was lighter than she was used to, making each step feel like a slow-motion dance with death. She had been raised in crystal palaces, educated in the finest academies, trained in diplomacy and statecraft. Nothing in her privileged upbringing had prepared her for this, for the brutal mathematics of survival on a dead world. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time moved strangely in the eternal dusk of Kethera, where the distant sun provided barely enough light to cast shadows. Naya's suit began to chime warnings about oxygen depletion, carbon dioxide buildup, power consumption. She ignored them all, focusing instead on putting one foot in front of the other, on the rhythm of her breathing, on the faint hope that someone, somewhere, might have heard her beacon's cry. It was then that she saw the light. At first, she thought it was another hallucination, the mind's desperate attempt to conjure hope where none existed. But as she crested a ridge of fused glass, she realized the glow was real. A structure nestled in the valley below, its windows warm with artificial light, its landing pad occupied by a sleek salvage runner that looked like it had seen better decades. Jackson Reed had been welding a stabilizer coupling. When his proximity sensors started screaming, he dropped his torch, cursing as the tool bounced across the workshop floor, and rushed to the monitoring station. The screens showed a heat signature approaching from the north, human-sized, moving slowly, leaving a trail of disturbed sand in its wake. His first instinct was to power down the facility, to make it look as abandoned as everything else on Kethera. Visitors were rarely good news out here, especially the kind that arrived unannounced. But something about the signature's movement pattern made him pause. It wasn't the confident stride of a bounty hunter or the measured advance of a military patrol. This was someone stumbling, someone desperate. He enhanced the image, zooming in on the approaching figure. The environmental suit was high-end, military or diplomatic grade, its blue and silver coloring unmistakably Dominion, but it was damaged, leaking atmosphere, its emergency beacons flashing red in the spectrum analysis. Whoever was inside wouldn't last much longer. Jackson had spent the last 5 years on Kethera, salvaging what he could from the mining ruins, staying off the grid, avoiding the kinds of entanglements that had once defined his life. He'd chosen isolation for good reasons. Too many people wanted him dead. Too many governments had prices on his head. The smart play was to let the stranger pass, to pretend he'd never seen them. But as he watched the figure stumble and fall, then struggle to rise again, he found himself reaching for his own suit. The workshop's airlock cycled with a hiss of equalizing pressure, and Jackson emerged into Kethera's thin atmosphere. His suit was older than the stranger's, patched and ray-patched, over years of use, but it was reliable. He'd learned to trust reliable over fancy a long time ago. He found her collapsed beside a twisted sculpture of melted mining equipment, her suit's emergency systems flashing critical warnings. Through the helmet's faceplate, he could see a young woman's face, pale and streaked with blood, her eyes closed. But her chest was still rising and falling, and her suit's bio-readings showed a steady, if weakened heartbeat. Jackson didn't hesitate. He'd seen too many people die in the void, too many souls lost to the cold mathematics of space. He scooped her up, surprised by how light she felt in the moon's weak gravity, and carried her back to his workshop. The woman in his arms stirred as he walked, her lips moving soundlessly behind the helmet's faceplate. The decontamination sequence seemed to take forever, but finally the inner airlock opened, and Jackson was able to lay her on the medical table he'd salvaged from an old hospital ship. Her suit's seals had held, but barely another few minutes, and she would have been breathing vacuum. As he worked to remove her helmet, Jackson caught sight of her face in the workshop's harsh lighting. She was beautiful in the way that only the genetically privileged could be, with the kind of refined features that spoke of generations of careful breeding. But there was something else there too, a strength in the set of her jaw, a defiance in the way she held herself even in unconsciousness. The helmet came free with a soft click, and she drew in a shuddering breath of the workshop's recycled air. Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused at first, then sharpening as they found his face. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then she whispered, in a voice like broken crystal, "You're human." It wasn't a question, but Jackson nodded anyway. "Names." Jackson Reed. "You're safe now." She tried to sit up, winced, and fell back against the table. I was. She stopped, seemed to gather herself. "My name is Naya Celestini. I was exiled from the ethereal dominion. My ship crashed, my pod is destroyed, and I have nowhere else to go." Jackson studied her face, noting the way her eyes flickered with pain. That wasn't entirely physical. He'd seen that look before, the hollow shock of someone whose world had been torn away from them. "Well, Naya Celestini," he said, reaching for a medical scanner. "You're not going anywhere for a while. That head wound needs attention, and your suit's life support is shot." "Why?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why help me? You don't know me, don't know what I've done." Jackson paused in his work, meeting her eyes. There was something in them, a mixture of hope and fear, of desperate need and proud refusal to beg. It reminded him of his own reflection during the darkest days of his exile, when he'd first arrived on Kethera with nothing but a broken ship and a head full of regrets. Because, he said simply, everyone deserves a chance to start over. As he worked to clean and dress her wounds, Naya found herself studying the man who had saved her life. He was older than she'd first thought, perhaps 40 standard years, with the kind of weathered face that spoke of hard choices and harder consequences. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, gentle but sure, and she noticed the way his eyes never quite met hers, as if he was afraid of what he might see there. The workshop around them was a study in organized chaos, filled with salvaged equipment, half-finished projects, and the accumulated debris of a solitary life. But it was clean, functional, and unmistakably home to someone who had learned to make do with what they had. "How long have you been here?" she asked, wincing as he cleaned a particularly deep cut on her forehead. 5 years, give or take," he replied, not looking up from his work. "Long enough to know that visitors are usually bad news. And yet you helped me." He finally met her eyes, and she saw something there, a flicker of pain, of old wounds that had never properly healed. "Like I said, everyone deserves a chance." As the hours passed and her strength slowly returned, Naya found herself talking to this strange, solitary man in ways she hadn't talked to anyone in years. Perhaps it was the isolation, or the shock of her exile, or simply the fact that he didn't know who she was supposed to be. But she found herself telling him about her life in the Dominion, about the crystal palaces and the political games, about the slow realization that her people's prosperity was built on the suffering of others. Jackson listened without judgment, occasionally asking questions that revealed a deeper understanding of galactic Poe. The morning light on Kethera was barely distinguishable from the perpetual twilight, but Naya had learned to recognize the subtle shift in the workshop's automated systems. As they cycled from night to day mode, she'd been here for 3 weeks now, and the rhythm of this place had become as familiar as her own heartbeat. The hum of recyclers, the distant ping of proximity sensors, the soft whisper of Jackson's boots on metal flooring as he went about his work. She found him where she always did in the mornings, hunched over a salvaged navigation console, his coffee growing cold as he lost himself in the intricate dance of circuits and code. His concentration was absolute, and she'd learned not to disturb him during these early hours. Instead, she moved quietly to the small galley, preparing breakfast from their dwindling stores of synthesized protein and recycled nutrients. The routine had developed naturally between them, born of proximity and necessity rather than any conscious decision. They moved around each other with the careful politeness of strangers who were slowly becoming something more, each day bringing small revelations. Tiny cracks in the walls they'd built around their hearts. The long-range sensors are picking up something, Jackson said without looking up from his work. Ship signature, about 6 hours out. Could be nothing, could be everything. Naya felt her stomach tighten. They'd both known this moment would come eventually, the outside world intruding on their fragile sanctuary. Dominion, hard to tell at this range. Could be traders, could be scavengers. He finally looked up, his eyes meeting hers across the workshop. Could be family. The word hung in the air between them like a challenge. Family. Naya had told him about her exile, about the council's betrayal, but she'd never spoken of those who might still care enough to come looking. The silence stretched until it became uncomfortable, filled with all the things they'd avoided saying to each other. I should go, she said finally. I've put you in enough danger just by being here. Where? The question was simple, but it carried the weight of everything they'd built together. Your pods scrap metal, your suits barely functional, and the nearest inhabited system is 3 months away by fast ship. Before she could answer, the workshop's communication system crackled. To life. Kethera Station. This is the salvage vessel Wanderer requesting permission to dock. We're running low on fuel and have credits to trade. Jackson's eyes never left Naya's face as he reached for the comm unit. Wanderer. This is Kethera Station. What's your cargo manifest? Mostly junk from the outer rim, some rare earth elements, a few intact data cores, nothing that'll interest the authorities. If that's what you're worried about. There was something in the voice, a familiar cadence that made Jackson's hand freeze. Over the controls. He'd heard that voice before, in another life, another place. Wanderer. Transmit your registration codes for verification. The pause that followed was telling. When the voice returned, it was careful, measured. Kethera Station. I'm reading you as Jackson Reed. That you? Little brother? Naya saw the color drain from Jackson's face, watched his hand tremble slightly as he set down the comm unit. Vera, he whispered, and she heard a lifetime of history in that single word. Permission to dock. Jax, we need to talk. An hour later, Naya watched from the workshop's observation deck as the Wanderer settled onto the landing pad. With practiced precision, the ship was sleek but well used, its hull scarred by years of hard travel and harder choices. As the airlock cycled, she found herself holding her breath, wondering what ghosts from Jackson's past were about to step into their carefully constructed world. The woman who emerged was striking in the way that spoke of genetic modification and military enhancement, tall, lean, with the kind of controlled grace that came from years of combat training. Her hair was the same dark brown as Jackson's, but her eyes were harder, colder, shaped by experiences that had left their mark in the set of her shoulders and the way her hand never strayed far from the weapon at her hip. Hello, Jax, she said, her voice carrying across the workshop's calm system. You look good. Domestic life agrees with you. Jackson's jaw tightened. Vera, it's been a long time. 5 years, 3 months, 16 days, not that I'm counting. She stepped further into the workshop, her gaze taking in every detail, every modification, every sign of the life he'd built here. Nice setup, very isolated. I like the quiet. You always did. Her eyes found Naya through the observation deck's transparent wall, and her expression shifted slightly. Going to introduce me to your friend. Naya descended the stairs slowly, conscious of the tension crackling between the siblings, up close. Vera Thorne was even more intimidating, the kind of woman who'd learned to survive in spaces where mercy was a luxury and trust was a liability. Naya Celestini, she said, extending her hand. I'm Princess Naya Celestini of the Ethereal Dominion, Vera finished, not taking the offered hand. Officially dead, according to the public records, unofficially. Worth about 50,000 credits to the right buyer. The words hit like a physical blow. Naya felt Jackson move beside her, his body tensing for violence. But Vera held up a hand. Relax, little brother. I'm not here for the bounty. Though I am curious how he managed to fall into this particular nest of vipers. She crashed here. Jackson said, his voice tight with warning. I helped her. That's all. That's all. Vera's laugh was sharp, bitter. Jax, you always were too good for your own good. Do you have any idea what you've stepped into? The Dominion doesn't just exile people, they erase them. The fact that someone's offering money for her head means she's more dangerous than she looks. I'm standing right here, Naya said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd once commanded fleets. If you have something to say about me, say it to my face. Vera studied her for a long moment, and Naya felt like she was being evaluated, weighed, measured against some internal standard. You want to know what I think? Princess, I think you're exactly what you appear to be, a privileged idealist who got too close to the truth and paid the price. The question is, what are you going to do about it? I don't understand. The bounty on your head isn't coming from the Dominion. It's coming from someone else. Someone who wants you found, but not necessarily returned. That means you know something, or you've seen something, or you are something that threatens the wrong people. Jackson moved to stand beside Naya, and she felt the warmth of his presence, like a shield against the implications of Vera's words. What do you know, Vera? I know that the Dominion's been hiring independent contractors to do work in the Outer Rim, ugly work. The kind that leaves entire colonies empty and corporate mining rights suddenly available. I know that someone's been asking questions about a certain princess who used to advocate for colonial rights, and I know that the same someone is offering enough money to make even honest salvagers think twice about minding their own business. The workshop fell silent except for the hum of life support systems and the distant whisper of Kethera's wind. Against the hull, Naya felt the weight of revelation settling over her like a shroud. The pieces of a puzzle she'd only half understood beginning to click into place. The colony reports, she said slowly, the ones that showed population decreases, mass relocations. I thought it was just bureaucratic incompetence, but you started asking questions, Vera finished. Started pushing for investigations, for oversight committees, for accountability. How close did you get to the truth? Close enough to get exiled, close enough to get killed. If you hadn't had the good sense to crash on my brother's doorstep. Vera's expression softened slightly as she looked at Jackson. You always did have a talent for finding strays. She's not a stray, Jackson said quietly. He didn't finish the sentence. But Naya heard what he couldn't say in the silence that followed. She felt her heart constrict, the weight of emotion she'd been carefully avoiding for weeks suddenly pressing against her chest like a physical force. She's what, Jax? Vera asked, her voice gentler now. What is she to you? Jackson looked at Naya, and in his eyes she saw everything they'd shared, the quiet mornings, the long conversations, the growing trust that had developed between them like a flower blooming in the darkness. She's the reason I remember what it feels like to be human. The words hung in the air between them, raw and honest and more revealing than any confession. Naya felt tears prick at her eyes, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming realization that somewhere in the ruins of her old life, she'd found something worth building new dreams around. Well, Vera said finally, that complicates things. How so? Because the people looking for her aren't going to stop, and because I came here to warn you both that they're getting close." She moved to the workshop's main display, calling up a star chart that showed the local systems. "I've been tracking their search pattern. They're using a grid system, checking every dead world, every abandoned station, every place someone might go to disappear. They'll reach Kethra within the month, then we run," Jackson said simply. "Where? They've got resources, connections, ships. You've got a workshop full of salvage and a woman who's legally dead. It's not exactly a fair fight." Naya found her voice. What are you suggesting?" Vera smiled, and for the first time since she'd arrived, it was genuine. "I'm suggesting we even the odds. I've got a ship, contacts, and AV." The trading station Nexus Point hung in the void like a metal flower, blooming from the intersection of 3 major shipping lanes, its rotating sections catching starlight and throwing it back in prismatic cascades. Naya pressed her face to the viewport of the Wanderer's passenger compartment, watching the massive structure grow larger as they approached. After a month on Kethra's desolate surface, the sight of civilization, even the rough, lawless kind that flourished at Nexus Point, felt overwhelming. "Second thoughts?" Vera asked from the pilot's seat, her hands dancing across the controls with practiced efficiency. "Third and fourth thoughts," Naya admitted, but no different conclusion. Behind them, Jackson was running final checks on their fabricated credentials. The past week had been a crash course in becoming someone else. New names, new histories, new faces courtesy of holographic disguise projectors that made Naya's skin crawl, but were necessary for survival. She was now Elena Voss, a salvage specialist from the Rim colonies. Jackson had become Jack Thorne, Vera's business partner. The story was simple enough to be believable, complex enough to discourage casual investigation. "Remember," Vera said as the docking clamps engaged with a metallic clang, "Nexus Point operates on 3 rules. Don't ask questions you don't want answered. Don't make promises you can't keep. And don't trust anyone who seems too helpful. The woman we're meeting has survived here for 15 years, which means she's either very smart or very dangerous, or both," Jackson added, checking his sidearm one last time. The station's docking bay was a controlled chaos of cargo haulers, passenger shuttles, and ships that looked like they'd been held together with hope and salvaged parts. The air recycling systems struggled to keep up with the mix of species and atmospheres, creating a cocktail of scents that made Naya's eyes water. But beneath the surface disorder, she could see the patterns, the careful territorial divisions, the subtle negotiations, the complex web of relationships that kept a place like this functioning. Their contact was waiting for them at a cantina called the Broken Chain, 3 levels up in the station's commercial sector. Zara Quinn looked exactly like what she was, a woman who'd learned to survive by being forgettable until the moment she chose not to be. Average height, brown hair, clothes that could belong to anyone from a dozen different worlds. But her eyes were sharp as laser cutters, and Naya noticed how she'd positioned herself with clear sight lines to 3 separate exits. "Vera Thorne," Zara said as they approached her table. "You look good for someone who's supposed to be dead." "Rumors of my demise were greatly exaggerated," Vera replied, settling into the booth with the casual alertness of a predator at rest. "Zara Quinn, I'd like you to meet my associates." Zara's gaze flicked over Jackson dismissively, then lingered on Naya. "Elena Voss, interesting choice of alias for someone of your background." Naya felt ice settle in her stomach. "I don't know what you mean." "Of course you don't." Zara smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Let me be clear about something, Princess. I know who you are, where you came from, and approximately how much your head is worth in the right markets. The only reason you're sitting here instead of in a holding cell is because Vera asked nicely, and because I have my own reasons for wanting the Dominion to suffer." "What reasons?" Jackson asked, his voice carefully neutral, "The kind that involve watching your homeworld get strip-mined into dust while the authorities look the other way." Zara's smile turned sharp. "But we're not here to discuss my motivations. We're here because you need information, and I need credits." Vera slid a data chip across the table. "Half now. Half when we have what we need." "And what exactly do you need?" "Everything you can find on the Dominion's colonial operations in the Outer Rim. Shipping manifests, personnel records, financial transfers, anything that connects official policy to what's actually happening on the ground. Zara palmed. The chip with practiced ease, that's a big ask. The kind that gets people disappeared if they're not careful. Can you do it? I can do anything if the price is right. The question is whether you're prepared for what you might find. Zara leaned forward, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. The Dominion's not just exploiting the colonies, they're erasing them. Entire populations relocated to temporary settlements that turn out to be permanent labor camps. Worlds declared uninhabitable after mysterious ecological disasters that clear the way for mining operations. Children separated from families and enrolled in educational programs that turn them into perfect little citizens. Naya felt bile rise in her throat. She'd suspected, had seen the reports, but hearing it laid out so starkly made it real in a way that statistics never could. How long has this been going on? 5 years, maybe 6. Started small, picked up pace after the resource wars ended, and the Dominion needed new sources of revenue. Zara studied Naya's face, and her expression softened slightly. You really didn't know, did you? All those questions you asked, all those committees you tried to form, you genuinely thought you could reform the system from within? I thought. Naya stopped, swallowed hard. I thought my people were better than this. People are people, princess. Give them enough fear and enough greed, and they'll rationalize anything. Zara stood, dropping a small device on the table. Encrypted communicator. I'll contact you when I have something. In the meantime, stay visible but not too visible. Act like tourists, blend in with the crowd. After she left, the three of them sat in silence for a long moment. The cantina's ambient noise, conversation, laughter, the clink of glasses seemed to come from another universe. A place where people didn't have to confront the casual enormity of institutional evil. We should get rooms, Vera said finally. It could take her days to compile what we need, and we're safer here than anywhere else for now. They found lodging in the station's transient quarters, a collection of small but clean rooms that catered to travelers who needed anonymity more than luxury. Naya stood at the narrow window of her assigned space, watching the flow of traffic through the station's corridors, trying to process everything she'd learned. A soft knock at her door interrupted her brooding. She opened it to find Jackson holding 2 cups of something that smelled like actual coffee, a luxury on a station like this. Thought you might need this, he said, offering her one of the cups. Thank you. She stepped aside to let him enter, grateful for his presence. The room felt less claustrophobic with him in it, less like a cell and more like a place where the people might find comfort in each other's company. They sat together on the narrow bed, shoulders touching, sharing warmth and silence. Outside, the station's artificial day cycle was shifting toward evening, the corridor lighting dimming to simulate sunset on a dozen different worlds. Do you ever wonder, Naya said finally, if we're doing the right thing, if some truths are too dangerous to uncover every day? Jackson admitted. But then I think about all the people who disappeared, all the families torn apart, all the worlds that got erased from the star charts. Someone has to bear witness. Someone has to care enough to remember, even if it costs us everything. He set down his cup, turned to face her fully. Naya, I lost everything once before. My career, my reputation, my family's trust. I thought it was the end of the world. But it led me to Kethera, and Kethera led me to you. Maybe sometimes losing everything is just another way of finding what actually matters. She leaned against him, drawing strength from his solid presence. I'm scared, Jax. Not of dying. I've made peace with that possibility, but of what we might discover, of how deep this goes. Then we'll be scared together. They were interrupted by a chime from the encrypted communicator. Zara had left them. Jackson activated it, and Zara's voice filled the small room, tense with urgency. You need to move. Now, someone's been asking questions about your ship, about 3 travelers matching your descriptions. I don't know who, but they've got Dominion credentials, and the kind of authority that makes station security nervous. Vera's voice crackled through from her own room. How long do we have? Maybe an hour before they start systematic searches. There's a freight hauler leaving for the Kepler system in 30 minutes. I can get you aboard, but it's going to cost extra. Do it, Naya said before anyone could object. Whatever it costs, do it. As they hastily packed their few belongings, Naya caught Jackson's arm. The Kepler system, that's not random, is it? No. He said grimly, it's where this all started, where the first colony disappeared. 20 minutes later, they were following Zara through the station's maintenance corridors, a maze of service tunnels and cargo lifts that connected Nexus Point's official levels to its hidden infrastructure, the freight hauler Zara had arranged. Passage on was a massive, ungainly vessel designed to carry bulk cargo between systems not comfortable, but anonymous. Captain's name is Rico Vasquez, Zara explained as they approached the loading bay. He's hauling agricultural equipment to the Kepler colonies, doesn't ask questions, and has a healthy respect for credits over curiosity. He'll get you there, safely. What about you? Vera asked. I'll stay here, keep digging. If your friends come back, I'll send them on a wild chase through the outer rim while you do. Whatever you're planning to do in Kepler, the loading bay was a cavern of stacked containers and automated loading systems, Captain. Kepler Prime hung in space like a sapphire caught in starlight, its azure oceans and emerald continents pristine from orbit. As the freight hauler descended toward the planet's main spaceport, Naya pressed her face to the viewport, searching for signs of the devastation Zara had described. But from this distance, the world looked untouched, a perfect jewel in the Dominion's crown. Appearances can be deceiving, Jackson said quietly, reading her thoughts. The real damage is usually where tourists don't go. The spaceport at New Geneva was a study in controlled efficiency, its gleaming terminals and manicured gardens designed to project an image of prosperity and order. But Naya noticed the subtle wrongness, the way security patrols moved in coordinated patterns, the facial recognition scanners disguised as decorative elements, the carefully managed flow of passengers that prevented any unauthorized congregation. Captain Vasquez bid them farewell with the relieved air of a man shedding unwanted complications. Good luck, he said, though his tone suggested he thought they'd need more than luck where they were going. Their forged credentials held up under casual inspection, but Naya could feel the weight of surveillance as they made their way through the terminal. Every camera tracked them, every scanner probed them. Every official they passed seemed to linger just a moment too long on their faces. We need transportation to the outer settlements, Vera said as they reached the commercial district, somewhere we can ask questions without attracting attention. They found what they were looking for in a rental agency run by a weathered woman, who introduced herself simply as Marta. Her aircar was old but well-maintained, and she accepted their credits without running a full background check, a small miracle in the current climate. Where you folks headed? She asked as she transferred the vehicle's access codes. Research expedition, Naya replied smoothly. We're studying ecological adaptation in frontier colonies. Marta's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. Lot of researchers been coming through lately. Most don't come back with much to report. Why not? Because there ain't much left to study. She lowered her voice, glancing around the empty rental bay. You want some advice? Stay in the approved zones. Don't go poking around the restricted areas. And if anyone asks you what you saw out there, you tell them you saw exactly what they want you to see. An hour later, they were flying low over Kepler Prime's northern continent, following coordinates Zara had provided before they left Nexus Point. The landscape below told a story of systematic destruction, disguised as development, vast mining operations where forests had once stood, geometric patterns of cleared land that spoke of forced agricultural restructuring, and scattered clusters of identical buildings that looked more like detention facilities than settlements. There, Vera said, pointing to a complex of structures nestled in a valley between two ridgelines. Harmony Settlement, according to the records. It houses 3,000 relocated colonists from the Outer Ring territories. As they descended toward the settlement's landing pad, Naya counted the buildings, maybe 40 structures in total, each designed to house perhaps 50 people. The mathematics didn't work. 3,000 people couldn't fit in a space designed for 2,000. Not without severe overcrowding. Their arrival was noted immediately. A security team met them at the landing pad, their uniforms bearing the Dominion crest, but their faces showing the telltale modifications of private military contractors. The leader, A tall man with cybernetic implants replacing his left eye stepped forward with the carefully neutral expression of someone accustomed to dealing with unwanted visitors. "Citizens, this is a restricted area. Please state your business." Vera stepped forward, her own military bearing creating an instant tension. "Environmental survey team. Authorized by Colonial Development Authority. We're here to assess ecosystem recovery in post-conflict zones." The security leader's artificial I-word as it focused on her credentials. For a moment, Naya thought their cover story might actually work. Then a new voice cut through the air like a blade. "I don't think that will be necessary." Naya's blood turned to ice as she recognized the speaker. Cale Morrison stepped out from behind one of the administrative buildings, his familiar features transformed by 5 years of serving the very system that had destroyed her life. He wore the uniform of a Dominion special investigator now, the silver insignia marking him as someone with authority to make people disappear. "Hello, Naya," he said, his voice carrying across the landing pad with devastating casualness. "It's been far too long." Time seemed to crystallize around that moment, Jackson's hand moving toward his weapon, Vera calculating distances and exit routes, the security team spreading out to cover all possible escape vectors. But Naya found herself rooted in place, staring at the man who had once promised to love her forever and who now wore betrayal like a badge of honor. "Cale," she managed, her voice steady despite the chaos in her chest. "I should have known they'd send you. The Dominion sends its best when the stakes are high enough." He stepped closer, and she could see the changes 5 years had wrought harder lines around his eyes, a coldness that hadn't been there when they were young and foolish and thought they could change. "The galaxy together. You look well. Exile seems to agree with you. What do you want?" "What I've always wanted, to serve the greater good." His smile was sharp as broken glass. "Though I admit, I was curious to see what had become of the idealistic princess who threw away everything for a handful of colonial malcontents. Is that what you tell yourself?" Naya stepped forward, ignoring the weapons trained on her. "That I threw it away. Not that it was stolen from me by cowards who couldn't face the truth about what they were doing." "The truth," Cale laughed, a sound devoid of warmth. "The truth is that the Dominion provides order, prosperity, and peace to trillions of citizens. The truth is that sometimes difficult decisions must be made for the greater good. The truth is that a few thousand colonial dissidents are an acceptable price for galactic stability. The truth," said a new voice, "is that you're a war criminal who's convinced himself he's a patriot." Everyone turned to see an elderly man approaching from the settlement's central plaza, his steps measured but determined. He was tall despite his age, with silver hair and eyes that burned with fierce intelligence. Naya felt her breath catch as she recognized features she'd inherited, mannerisms she'd learned at his knee. "Grandfather," she whispered. Elder Thane Voss looked exactly as she remembered him, the last honest politician in the Dominion's council, the man who'd taught her that power was meaningless without conscience. He'd disappeared from public life shortly after her exile, and she'd assumed he was dead. "My dear child," he said, reaching out to touch her face with hands that trembled slightly with age. "I've been waiting for you. Why are you here?" "Because someone needs to bear witness. Because someone needs to remember what we're losing." His eyes shifted to encompass the settlement around them, the barely hidden desperation of its inhabitants, the careful choreography of oppression disguised as benevolence. "And because I hope that someday you would come home." Kel's weapon appeared in his hand with practiced smoothness. "Elder Voss, you're under arrest for violating the terms of your house detention. And Princess Naya Celestini, you're under arrest for treason, sedition, and violation of exile orders." "On whose authority?" Naya demanded. "Mine." Another figure emerged from the shadows, a woman in the elaborate robes of a Dominion High Counselor, her face hidden behind a ceremonial mask. When she removed it, Naya saw features that were almost familiar, distorted by genetic modification and surgical enhancement. "Hello, cousin." Counselor Lion of Voss had been beautiful once, before ambition and augmentation had transformed her into something that resembled humanity. Without quite achieving it, she was Naya's father's sister, the woman who had maneuvered herself into power after the exile, who had argued most forcefully for Naya's permanent banishment. Aunt Lyanna, Naya said, the childhood name feeling strange on her tongue. I should have known you'd be behind this. Behind what? Bringing order to chaos? Providing prosperity where there was only poverty. Lyanna gestured toward the settlement with practiced theatrical flair. These people live better lives now than they ever did in their squalid frontier colonies. They have food, shelter, purpose. They have cages, Elder Voss said quietly. Comfortable cages. Perhaps, but cages nonetheless. Freedom is overrated. Father, security, stability, predictability, these are the gifts we give to those too weak to provide for themselves. Naya looked around the settlement with new eyes, seeing past the surface order to the underlying reality. The buildings were indeed well maintained, but she noticed the guards positioned at every intersection, the subtle barriers that channeled movement along predetermined paths, the way conversations stopped when officials passed by. Where are the children? She asked suddenly. The question hung in the air like an accusation. Lyanna's expression didn't change, but Naya caught the slight tightening around her eyes. The children are being educated, properly educated, in facilities designed to give them opportunities their parents never had, separated from their families, and indoctrinated, Jackson said, speaking for the first time since Kel's arrival, turned into perfect lit. The crystal gardens of Etheria had always been Naya's sanctuary, but returning to them now felt like walking through a graveyard of memories. The floating platforms still drifted serenely above the capital city, their bioluminescent flora casting rainbow patterns across the morning sky. But the beauty felt hollow, a magnificent facade concealing the rot beneath. 3 months had passed since their escape from Kepler Prime. 3 months of careful planning, dangerous alliances, and the painstaking work of building a case that could bring down the Dominion's colonial program. Now, as Naya stood in the private gardens of her family's estate, she felt the weight of everything they'd sacrificed to reach this moment. The council convenes in 2 hours, Elder Voss said, approaching through the crystal archway that led to the mansion's main halls. At 93, he moved more slowly than he once had, but his mind remained sharp as a laser scalpel. Are you ready as someone can be for political suicide? Naya replied, her fingers trailing across the petals of a gossamer rose that seemed to glow with inner fire. The evidence is damning, but evidence and justice aren't always the same thing. No, her grandfather agreed. But sometimes bearing witness is enough. Sometimes the truth finds its own way into the light. Behind them, the estate bustled with quiet activity. Jackson was in the communications center, coordinating with Marcus Webb and a network of journalists, activists, and sympathetic officials who would simultaneously release the documentation they'd gathered. Vera was reviewing security protocols with Consul Ren Ashford, the reformed council member who'd agreed to sponsor their petition for an emergency session. It was Ashford who'd made their return possible, using his influence to guarantee safe passage and a formal hearing. A slight man with prematurely gray hair and eyes that held the weight of too many compromises. He'd been horrified by the evidence they'd presented. More importantly, he'd been smart enough to realize that the colonial program's exposure was inevitable. The only question was whether the Dominion would reform itself or be torn apart by revelation. Princess Naya, a young voice called from the garden's entrance. May I speak with you? Naya turned to see Luna Reed, Jackson's 12-year-old niece, approaching with the careful steps of someone who'd learned to navigate political complexity. At an age when she should have been playing with toys, Luna had arrived on Etheria 2 days ago with her guardian Jackson's sister-in-law, who'd been caring for the girl since his brother's death in the frontier wars. Of course, Luna, what's on your mind? Uncle Jack says you're going to talk to the important people today about the bad things happening to families on other worlds. Naya knelt to bring herself to the girl's eye level, struck by the serious expression on such a young face. That's right. We're going to try to make sure those bad things stop happening. Will it work? The question hung in the air with devastating simplicity. How do you explain to a child that sometimes doing the right thing isn't enough, that power protects itself, that comfortable lies often triumph over uncomfortable truths? I don't know, Naya said finally. But we have to try. Because if we don't, who will? Luna nodded as if this made perfect sense. Uncle Jack says you're very brave. He says you gave up being a princess to help people you'd never met. Your uncle is very kind, but I think he's the brave one. He gave up his safety to help me when he had no reason to trust me. Maybe you're both brave. Luna suggested with the logic of childhood. Maybe that's why you work so well together. Out of the mouths of babes, Naya thought. Maybe we are. An hour later, Naya stood before her dressing mirror, adjusting the formal robes she hadn't worn since her exile. The fabric felt strange against her skin, to fine, to perfect, to removed from the practical clothes she'd grown accustomed to on Kethera and beyond. But today, she needed to look like what she was, a princess of the realm, speaking truth to power. Jackson appeared in the doorway, his own formal attire transforming him from the rough salvager she'd fallen in love with into something that resembled a diplomat. How do you feel? Terrified, she admitted, but also free. For the first time in my life, I'm going to speak without worrying about the political consequences, because you've already paid them, because I've finally learned what's worth paying them for. She turned to face him, drinking in the sight of the man who'd become her anchor in the storm. Jax, if this goes badly, it won't. But if it does, I want you to know that these months with you have been the best of my life. Not because of where we've been or what we've done, but because you've shown me what it means to choose love over duty, truth over comfort. He crossed the room in 3 strides, taking her face in his hands with the gentle reverence that had become as familiar as breathing. Naya Celestini, whatever happens in that council chamber, you've already changed everything that matters. You've changed me, changed the way I see the universe, changed what I believe is possible. Even if we lose, especially if we lose, because someone will remember that we tried. Someone will carry the story forward. The kiss they shared was soft, desperate, full of all the words they couldn't say. When they broke apart, Naya felt something shift inside her, the last vestige of the frightened exile falling away, replaced by the woman she was meant to become. The Minion High Council chamber was a marvel of architecture and intimidation, its crystalline walls rising toward a domed ceiling that showed real-time images of every world. Under the Empire's protection, 12 seats ranged in a perfect circle, each occupied by one of the most powerful beings in known space. And at the center, a simple podium where truth came to die. Naya walked toward that podium with measured steps, conscious of every eye upon her, every camera recording her words for posterity. Behind her, in the observer's gallery, sat Jackson, Vera, Marcus, and Luna, the family she'd chosen, the people worth risking everything to protect. Council members, she began, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber's perfect acoustics. I stand before you today not as a petitioner seeking mercy, but as a citizen demanding justice. I stand here with evidence of crimes committed, in your names, with testimony from survivors of policies you've endorsed, with proof that the Dominion's colonial program is nothing more than systematic genocide, disguised as development. The reaction was immediate and predictable. Counselor Lyon arose from her seat, her artificially enhanced features twisted with practiced outrage. This council will not be lectured by a convicted traitor who dared to ask inconvenient questions, Naya interrupted, her voice cutting through the chamber like a blade. Who refused to accept comfortable lies when the truth was too ugly to acknowledge. For the next hour, she laid out their case with methodical precision. The documents Zara had obtained, the testimonies Marcus had collected, the evidence of systematic population transfers and cultural erasure. She spoke of children stolen from their parents, of worlds stripped bare and left to die, of the careful bureaucratic machinery that turned atrocity into policy. The council listened with the stony faces of people whose power depended on not hearing what they were being told. But Naya noticed the subtle shifts, a glance between two members, a tightening of hands on armrests, the way certain counselors avoided looking at the evidence displays. When she finished, the chamber fell silent except for the soft hum of life support systems. Then Counselor Lyon spoke, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. An interesting fiction, niece. But even if we were to accept these allegations, what would you have us do? Abandon the colonies to chaos? Allow primitive cultures to impede galactic progress? Sacrifice the security of trillions for the comfort of thousands? I would have you remember what the Dominion was supposed to represent, Naya replied. Not conquest disguised as protection, but genuine prosperity shared by all. Not the erasure of diversity, but the celebration of it. Not the reduction of sapient beings to economic units, but the recognition of their inherent worth. Pretty words, Lyanna said dismissively. But words don't feed populations, don't maintain order, don't prevent wars. Neither does genocide. The word hung in the air like a physical presence, heavy with implication and accusation. Several council members shifted uncomfortably, while others maintained their masks of indifference. Consul Ashford rose from his seat, his thin frame somehow commanding attention, despite his lack of physical presence. I move for an immediate investigation into these allegations, with full subpoena power and independent oversight. Seconded, said another voice from across the chamber. Councillor Elena Torvin, whose own world had been developed by the Dominion 3 decades earlier. The debate that followed was fierce but brief. Political calculations were made, alliances shifted, and the hard mathematics of power asserted themselves. In the end, the vote was closer than anyone had expected, 7-5, against the investigation, with the deciding votes coming from councillors whose own worlds benefited from the colonial program. Motion fails, announced the council's presiding officer with bureaucratic finality. The session is adjourned, but as the council members filed out, their expressions carefully neutral, Naya noticed something else. Whispered conversations, data tablets discreetly exchanged, the subtle signs of a political earthquake beginning to build. Th.